My name is Elena Marchetti. I was 28 when I learned that family, like water, always finds the lowest point in a room. It came as a text, not a phone call. That detail mattered more than anything else that followed. My mother had never once texted me anything important in her life. Not my grandmother's diagnosis, not my father's surgery, not even the year the house almost burned down. Important things, in the Marchetti family, were spoken, argued over, softened with a laugh so no one had to feel the weight of them out loud. So when the message came, "We've finalized the cabins for the cruise, sweetheart. It's a tight squeeze this year. We'll catch up when we're back." I read it 3 times before I understood what it meant. I hadn't been left off by accident. I had been left off on purpose, and someone had decided a text was the gentlest way to do it. I was standing in my kitchen in Providence, the late afternoon light coming in low and gold across the counter, a kettle just starting to hum on the stove behind me. I remember setting my phone down very carefully, the way you set down something that might still be capable of hurting you if you're not careful with it. I did not cry. I want to be honest about that because so much of what follows depends on the reader understanding that I did not, in that first moment, feel rage. I felt something quieter and colder. I felt confirmed. Because this wasn't new. It was only the clearest version of something that had been happening since I was 9 years old, since my brother Nico first learned that being adored took less effort than being honest, and that our mother would always choose the version of the family that felt good over the version that was true. The cruise itself didn't matter. I want to say that plainly. I had no great love of the ocean, no burning need to stand on a deck with a glass of Prosecco while my aunts asked when I was going to settle down. What mattered was the arithmetic of it, the quiet, practiced ease with which I had been subtracted from a celebration that existed, on paper, to celebrate my grandfather's 80th birthday. My grandfather, the one man in that family who had never once made me feel like a guest in my own bloodline. I called my cousin Dana that evening because Dana was incapable of diplomacy and I needed, for once, someone who wouldn't manage my feelings for me. "They didn't tell you?" she said, and the pause before it told me everything. "Elle, I thought you knew. It's a whole thing. Nico said the yacht only holds so many, and since you and Marcus split up there wasn't really a +1 to account for. And Elle, I'm so sorry, I assumed someone called you. The yacht only holds so many." I sat with that phrase for a long time after we hung up, not because it wounded me in the way Dana probably imagined, because of the small, private irony sitting underneath it, one that nobody in my family, not my mother, not my brother, not one single aunt with her practiced sympathetic tilt of the head, had any idea was true. The yacht they were sailing on was called the Seraphine. I had renamed her myself, 11 months earlier, the week the acquisition closed. I did not tell Dana that. I did not tell anyone. I simply said, "It's fine. Tell everyone I hope it's a beautiful trip," and I meant it, in the strange, hollowed-out way you can mean a kindness you no longer feel obligated to perform for free. Then I made tea, and I sat by the window, and I let myself, finally, remember. To understand why a text message could undo me, you would have to understand the ledger I had been keeping since childhood. Not out of bitterness, but out of the quiet self-preservation of a girl who learned early that love in my family was distributed like inheritance, unevenly and usually to the loudest claimant. Nico was 2 years older than me, and radiant, in the specific way that lets a person get away with almost anything. He forgot birthdays and was forgiven with a laugh. I forgot nothing and was thanked with an expectation. When we were children, my mother used to say, "Elena's the responsible one," in the same tone she might use to describe a well-built shelf, useful, sturdy, and never once mistaken for beautiful. I don't say this to paint her as a villain. Mothers are rarely villains. They are usually just tired women repeating a shape they themselves were poured into. My mother had grown up the responsible one in her own family, the one who managed and steadied, and never got to be fragile in front of anyone. She simply handed the role down to me the way you hand down a coat that no longer fits you, without asking if it fit the next person either. Still, there is a difference between understanding where a wound comes from and no longer feeling it. I remembered the year I was 12, when Nico wrecked my father's car 2 weeks after getting his license, and the story that circulated at Thanksgiving was about how frightened he must have been. how grateful we should all be that he was safe. I remembered being 16 and winning a state essay competition on the same weekend Nico broke his ankle trying to skateboard down our neighbor's driveway, and how the ankle got a cast signed by 20 relatives while my trophy sat on a shelf that no one asked about. None of these were catastrophes. That was the insidious part. No single memory was large enough to justify anger. It was only in aggregate, in the slow accumulation of 1,000 small emissions, that the shape of it became visible, the way a shoreline only reveals its true form from very far above. I left for college and did not come back easily. I built a life instead, quietly, methodically, the way I had always done everything. A degree in maritime logistics that made my mother's friends ask, gently, "But what will you do with that, dear?" An entry-level job at a shipping firm in Newport that I did not tell anyone I loved, because loving something out loud in my family was an invitation for someone to make it small. A decade of decisions no one at those Thanksgiving tables ever asked me about, because I had stopped, somewhere along the way, offering up the details of my life for approval I had learned wasn't coming. By the time I was 27, I was overseeing acquisitions for a private maritime holding group, charter fleets, marina developments, a handful of vessels bought quietly out of bankruptcy and restored. It was unglamorous work, mostly. Spreadsheets and inspection reports and long calls with brokers in 3 time zones. But it was mine, built without a single hand from home resting on it, and there was a fierce, private pride in that. The Seraphine had come to us as part of a larger portfolio, 6 vessels, 1 marina lease, a name I recognized the moment I saw it on the paperwork and told myself, for one long beat in a conference room in Miami, was surely a coincidence. It was not a coincidence. It was the same charter company my brother had used for 2 family trips already, the one whose brochures my mother left conspicuously on the kitchen table each spring. I had said nothing when I signed off on the acquisition. There had seemed, at the time, no reason to. Now there was. I did not sleep well the week after Dana's call. Not from anger. Anger, at least, has momentum, a direction to travel in. What I felt instead was stiller and stranger, a kind of suspended disbelief, the sensation of watching a pattern complete itself exactly as you always suspected it would, without the satisfaction of being wrong. I went to work. I signed contracts. I sat in a meeting about hull maintenance schedules for the Seraphine and heard someone say her name 3 times before I fully registered that I was listening to logistics for the very trip I hadn't been asked on. At night, I found myself doing something I hadn't done in years, pulling out an old shoebox of photographs my grandfather had given me before he moved into assisted living the previous spring. He was the reason, if I was honest, that any of this cut as deep as it did. Not my mother. Not Nico. My grandfather had been the one person who called me on my birthday every year without fail, who kept a folder of newspaper clippings about the maritime industry because he knew, vaguely, that it was my world, even if he never fully understood what I did in it. 80 years old, I thought, holding a photograph of him young and sunbrowned on some dock in Genoa, decades before any of us existed. And I won't be there. There was a letter in the box, too. One he'd written me the year I graduated college, the kind of letter men of his generation rarely wrote, full of careful, old-fashioned sentences. "You were always the one who noticed things," it said. "Don't let anyone convince you that noticing is the same as not mattering." I read it twice and put it back in the box, and something in my chest, which had been clenched tight since the text message, loosened by 1 degree. I did not, in that moment, decide to seek revenge. I want to be precise about this, because the version of this story where a woman transforms overnight into a mastermind is a satisfying one, but it isn't a true one. What I decided, sitting on my apartment floor at 11 at night with a dead grandfather's, no, not dead, I corrected myself, aging, and the correction itself brought its own small grief, with a living grandfather's letter in my lap, was simpler than revenge. I decided I would not beg to be let back in. And I decided, separately, almost as an afterthought, that I would call the operations director of our charter division in the morning and ask a single question: which crew had been assigned to the Seraphine for the Marchetti family charter departing in 3 weeks. Not to interfere. Not yet. Only to know. There is a particular kind of power that comes from knowing something other people don't, and I want to be honest that it frightened me, at first, how easily it could curdle into something uglier than justice. I sat with my operations director's email for 2 full days before responding, a manifest listing the Seraphine's upcoming charters, my family's name 3 lines down, booked under my brother's, with a note that the booking agent had specifically requested an elevated 10-year birthday package for the ship's owner's grandfather. The ship's owner. Meaning me. Meaning a phrase my own family had used about a man they thought was some rich stranger's grandfather, never imagining that the words applied, technically, to the very woman they'd just uninvited. I could have called my mother that night and told her everything. I imagined it more than once. The silence on the other end of the line, the scramble to recalibrate, the frantic, humiliated attempt to reverse the exclusion before the trip even began. Some small, wounded part of me wanted exactly that. The swift correction, the apology extracted like a confession. But I kept thinking of my grandfather's letter. Don't let anyone convince you that noticing is the same as not mattering. And I understood, slowly, that if I forced my way back onto that boat through leverage rather than love, I would only be trading one kind of exclusion for another, proving my worth through ownership instead of being wanted for myself. That wasn't justice. That was just a different, more expensive cage. So, I made a different decision. I would not go on the cruise. I would not ask to. But I would not hide the truth forever, either. I would simply let it surface in its own time, the way truths in families eventually do, without my hand forcing it. I called the operations director back and gave one instruction only, that the crew treat the Marchetti family exactly as they would treat any client. No preferential treatment. No mention of my name unless it came up naturally. I wanted no orchestrated reveal, no theater. If they were going to find out, I wanted it to happen the way truth usually does, sideways, unplanned, in a moment no one had scripted. Then I did something that surprised even me. I booked a flight to visit my grandfather at his care facility the same week the cruise was to depart, so that whatever was happening 1,000 miles away on the water, I would be sitting instead with the one person whose birthday this had always actually been about. I wasn't there, so I can only tell what happened aboard the Seraphine the way it was told to me afterward, first by Dana in fragments over a long phone call 2 weeks later, and then, much harder to hear, by my mother herself. The first days were unremarkable, by every account. My family settled into staterooms that Nico had proudly described as top-tier, posted photographs of sunset cocktails and my grandfather beaming in a paper birthday crown someone had bought at a party store in Fort Lauderdale. I looked at those photographs when Dana sent them. My grandfather smiled genuine and easy, and felt something complicated, grief and relief tangled together. Glad he was happy. Sorry I wasn't the one making him so. The unraveling, when it came, was almost absurdly small. On the 3rd evening, my grandfather, who has never in his life been able to resist a good conversation with anyone in a uniform, waiter or ship's officer alike, struck up a conversation with the Seraphine's captain during dinner service. He asked, as he apparently asks everyone, about the ship's history, her tonnage, her age, who had restored her teak decking so beautifully. The captain, with no idea he was stepping into anything, answered honestly. He mentioned the acquisition 11 months prior. He mentioned, with the casual pride of a man who liked his employer, the name of the holding group. And then, because my grandfather pressed, because my grandfather always presses, gently, the way water presses against stone, the captain mentioned that the woman who'd personally signed off on the Seraphine's restoration budget was named Elena Marchetti. Dana told me my grandfather went very quiet at the table. Then he asked the captain to repeat the name. By the time my mother called me, not texted, called, her voice unsteady in a way I had rarely heard, the whole family already knew, and had known for a full day, unable to agree amongst themselves who should be the one to phone me first. "Why didn't you tell us?" she asked, and there was something underneath the question that wasn't quite anger and wasn't quite shame, some third thing I didn't have a name for yet. "Tell you what?" I said. "That I own part of a shipping company?" I didn't think it was relevant to whether or not there was room for me on a boat. The silence that followed was longer than any silence we'd shared in years. My grandfather called me himself 2 days later, once they were back on land. Not my mother, not Nico, my grandfather, his voice smaller over the phone than I remembered but no less certain. "You should have been on that boat," he said, without preamble. Not because of any of this business nonsense. Because it was my birthday and you're my granddaughter, and somebody decided that wasn't reason enough. I felt something crack open in my chest, hearing him say it so plainly. The thing I had wanted someone in my family to say for 2 decades, finally spoken aloud, and not even because he knew about the yacht. He had wanted me there before he ever heard the captain say my name. That was the part that undid me, sitting on my kitchen floor for the second time in a month, phone pressed to my ear, crying at last quietly the way I do most things. "I'm not angry that you own it," he went on. "I'm angry that none of us ever bothered to ask you what you'd built. 28 years old, and I find out what my own granddaughter does for a living from a ship captain." I didn't tell him it was fine. I had spent a lifetime saying things were fine when they weren't, smoothing the family's edges so no one else had to feel the friction. This time I let it sit, uncorrected, true. My mother's reckoning took longer, and was harder for both of us. She called again a week later, this time without the shock, just the aftermath. "I think," she said carefully, "I built a whole idea of you out of the parts of you that were easy to manage. The responsible one. The one who didn't need extra." I never once asked if that was true, or if you'd just gotten tired of proving it wasn't. It wasn't an apology, not exactly. But it was, for my mother, close enough to one that I recognized the shape of it, and did not need her to say the word to accept what she meant by it. Nico, for his part, sent a long, stumbling text about how he hadn't meant anything by the cabin comment, how he'd just been trying to make the numbers work and hadn't thought it through. I believed him mostly. That was almost the saddest part, that no one had acted out of cruelty. They had simply, for years, forgotten to wonder whether I might be more than the space I was expected to occupy. I want to be honest about the things I didn't do, because I think they matter as much as the things I did. I didn't gloat. I didn't send my family a folder of acquisition documents, didn't make a single joke about who, technically, could have had them all removed from the ship for non-payment if I'd been feeling small enough to want to. The temptation existed. I won't pretend otherwise. There is a particular, ugly satisfaction available to anyone who has been quietly diminished for years and suddenly finds themselves holding all the leverage. I understood that satisfaction. I simply decided I didn't want to build anything lasting out of it. I didn't demand a second cruise, some do-over voyage where I would be installed at the head of the table as compensation for the one I'd missed. That would only have been trading one kind of performance for another, proving my worth through spectacle instead of simply existing as someone worth including in the first place. What I did instead was smaller and harder, and I think more honest. I started saying no to things I didn't want to do, without the elaborate, apologetic explanations I used to attach to every boundary like a tax I owed for having one. I told my mother, gently, the next time she left me off a family group text about my aunt's retirement party, that I'd noticed and that I'd like to be included going forward. Not because of anything I owned, but because I was her daughter, and that should have been enough on its own. I visited my grandfather again the following month, and this time I brought him something better than a shoebox of photographs. I brought him aboard, quietly one afternoon, to see the Seraphine in dry dock, her hull being repainted, and watched his face as he understood, really understood, the scope of what his responsible, forgettable granddaughter had built while no one was asking. "You didn't need to prove anything to me," he said, running his hand along a section of new railing. "I know," I told him. "I think I did it for myself." He nodded, the way he does when he's decided a thing is true and worth not arguing with. It has been almost a year now. The family group chat looks a little different, not transformed, not some tidy redemption arc where everyone suddenly sees me clearly and every old wound dissolves. Families don't work that way, and I've stopped expecting mine to be an exception. My mother still, occasionally, defaults to old habits, still sometimes assumes I'll be the flexible one, the one who won't mind. But there are more moments now where she catches herself, where I watch her stop mid-sentence and choose differently. That's not nothing. That might, in fact, be everything a person like me ever really wanted, not grand apologies, just small, repeated proof that I'd been seen. I still own my share of the Seraphine. I have never once used that fact as a weapon, and I don't intend to. But I notice, now, when my name comes up in family conversations, that it comes up differently. Not as an afterthought, not as the responsible one who'll understand if there isn't room, but as someone whose life the others have started, slowly, to grow curious about. My grandfather turned 81 this spring. This time, there was no cruise, just a quiet dinner at his care facility, small enough that no one had to be subtracted from it. I sat beside him the whole evening, and at some point, between the birthday cake and the slow gathering of coats, he leaned over and said, "So only I could hear it. I like this version better. Everyone's here." I think about that sentence more than I think about anything the captain said, more than the acquisition papers, more than the quiet reckoning that followed. Everyone's here. Not because of tonnage or teak decking or a name on a corporate filing. Just a family, finally, small enough and honest enough to fit everyone who is always supposed to belong. The Seraphine still sails most weekends, chartered out to strangers who have no idea what her name once meant to the family who almost left someone behind on her deck. I like to think of her out there sometimes, cutting through calm water under some other family's laughter, carrying no memory of what she witnessed the year I wasn't aboard. But I remember, not with bitterness anymore, with something closer to clarity. The sea doesn't keep score. People do, if we let them, and then, if we're lucky, we learn, slowly, imperfectly, one true conversation at a time, how to put the ledger down.